Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Sarah and Sarah. So since I've been asked to talk a bit more about the historical background and the historical context of the Lod Mosaic and Judea, or the province of Judea, Palaestina in the broader sense of the Roman Empire, I thought it would be appropriate to actually begin with a little story that we know from the church historian and later bishop of Caesarea in Judea, Eusebius. So Eusebius tells us that in 310 CE, which is roughly the very same time of the Lod Mosaic, actually a group of Egyptian Christians was brought before the Roman governor of Palaestina, named Phimelianus. And upon interrogation, their leader was asked about his name, and he didn't give to the Roman governor the name that he had received from his father, but instead he gave him the name of a biblical prophet. Afterwards, Phimelianus, the Roman governor, actually asked this anonymous leader of the Egyptian Christians about his patris, his hometown or his homeland. And the Egyptian Christian gave the name of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, the Roman governor had never heard of a place like this. He knew the city of Jerusalem only under the name of Aelia Capitolina, which was the name that it received 160 years before 310, under the Emperor Hadrian. Phimelianus now inquired further, using torture, and discovered what kind of city that was. And the Egyptian Christian, who presumably came from Jerusalem, said Jerusalem is a city that lies towards the east, and it's populated by people like me, by people who are believers in God. Actually, Phimelianus, the Roman governor, panicked, because he now thought that the Christians already had or were about to establish a city of their own, secretly, somewhere in the east, of course hostile to the Romans. He pressed further, but as he couldn't get more information from the Christian leader, he actually sentenced him to death. Eusebius was a contemporary. He lived in Judea, Palaestina at the time, which is the time of the great persecution of the Christians at the beginning of the 4th century. And he recounts the story, of course, to tell us about the martyrdom of the Christians in Palestine. But he also tells us more about the very political situation at the time in Roman Judea. So what we encounter in this story is a Roman governor who's clearly out of touch with the history and the traditions of the province that he is supposed to govern. We see an administration that very easily panics because of internal instability and instability of its borders. We see an administration that uses oppression and persecution in order to reaffirm imperial authority and power, and also stages bloody spectacles, public executions to display and reaffirm the power of the emperor and those who govern on his behalf. So that is, in fact, the historical context of the Lod Mosaic. When we look back at the political history of Roman Judea, we actually talk about a history that is usually, when we simply go through the narrative of events, a history of turmoil and of conflict. So Judea was brought under Roman control in the 1st century BCE, in the 60s, under Pompey the Great, who actually conquered a lot of the east. So all these areas here, colored in yellow, were added to the Roman dominion under Pompey the Great in less than 10 years. The Romans, however, weren't really interested in bringing Judea under their control, and they experimented a bit in how to actually keep Judea under control without really governing it. So what they did is first they installed a client king. This is the famous Herod the Great, who ruled over a vast territory that actually included all these areas over here. And Herod the Great, even though he had to deal with a lot of opposition, with a lot of resistance among his subjects, ruled more or less successfully for more than 3 decades. After his death, his kingdom was divided between 3 of his sons, and the core here, the area colored in yellow, was given to his eldest son, Archelaus. Unfortunately, Archelaus didn't prove to be as successful a ruler as his father, and only 10 years after his establishment as ruler of Judea, he was deposed by the Roman Emperor Augustus. So in 6 CE, we have for the first time direct Roman rule over Judea, and the Roman province of Judea was established. So this is a heterogeneous province. The majority of the population is Jewish. We do have the city of Jerusalem at its very center, but we also have major cities at the Mediterranean coast, which are largely Roman or Hellenistic, both in terms of their population as well as in terms of their character. Most prominently, Caesarea on the sea over here. So the Roman province of Judea, therefore, comprised both Jerusalem, and you can see here a model of the Jewish temple as it was rebuilt by Herod at the end of the 1st century BCE. And on the other hand, you can see here an artistic reconstruction of that harbor town, Caesarea on the sea, as it was built by Herod, including one of the biggest and most effective harbors of the Mediterranean, of the whole Mediterranean at that time. And as I said, this is a major city. It's a city with a clearly Hellenistic Roman character, including a temple dedicated to Augustus and Roma, which was right here, therefore the very first building that every visitor would see who came to Judea and to Caesarea from the sea. So a very heterogeneous province. So actually, the province of Judea is the province that we do know most about from the entire Roman Empire in the 1st century CE. And this is because we have so many sources from a Jewish background, from a Christian background, and from a Roman background. And while this is a very different set of sources, they actually all agree that the Roman governors were either incapable, and most of them were actually worse. And so the famous Roman governor Pontius Pilate is only one among them, and this is the famous inscription that had been found in Caesarea, where you can actually, if you look very closely, see his name, Pilatus, in the second line. What else do we know about Judea? Well, we know that especially the 1st century CE, the decades leading up to the first revolt, the first Jewish revolt, very, very tumultuous. We hear about a lot of conflicts between the population and the Roman administration and within the Jewish population. We hear about growing mistrust between the Jewish population and their very own local elites. And we hear about growing resistance against Roman rule in general. So in 66 CE, the famous first Jewish revolt broke out. It was crushed by the Romans basically in 70 CE, when Jerusalem was seized, was mostly destroyed. The Jewish temple was destroyed and never allowed to be rebuilt. And most of you actually know from Rome that the major victory, the supposedly major victory of the Romans over this Jewish revolt was commemorated in many places in Rome, including the famous Arch of Titus at the end of the Roman Forum, where we also have this very famous relief, which is here in the passageway, actually showing us the Roman triumph when the spoils from Jerusalem, including the menorah from the Jewish temple, were paraded through the streets of Rome. And also we have multiple of these coin types actually celebrating the military victory over the rebellious province of Iudaea, where you see the palm tree as a symbol of Judea, with the personification of the province here, mourning, and a Roman soldier standing strong on the other side. So the first Jewish revolt, or let's say the crushing, the end of the first Jewish revolt, was of course a major event in Jewish history and in the history of Judea. And it was followed by a second major revolt, the so-called Bar Kokhba revolt, only 50 years afterwards. So in the 130s, under the Emperor Hadrian. And again, this revolt was crushed by the Romans, and again had major impacts on the very layout, the character, the landscape of the province. Because afterwards, or either shortly before or after the revolt, Jerusalem was refounded as Aelia Capitolina. Aelia in order to honor Hadrian, whose family name was Aelius. So Aelia Capitolina, now Jerusalem, a Roman town, and more than that, Jews were actually prohibited from settling in Jerusalem or its vicinity. Secondly, and you can see here a coin from later on in the 2nd century CE, from under the emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, where you can actually here see Colonia, Aelia, Capitolina, and a head of the god Serapis, so a clearly pagan city now. What else changed? So by now, Judea had 2 legions encamped in the very province. The province that was now renamed, not Judea anymore, but Palaestina. So to deprive the province of its Jewish identity, very clearly a sign of how now the central administration would deal with its Jewish subjects. So one of the legions was stationed near Aelia Capitolina, the other one up here in, or near a settlement that would later be called Legio. And with troops, we don't only have a growing presence of Romans in Judea, military presence. At that time, Judea isn't a border province anymore, which actually makes it the most militarized non-border province in the Roman Empire. So just a comparison, the much larger province of Syria, just to the north, where with an actual border to the Parthian Empire, only had 3 legions, so only one more than tiny Judea. So we have about 10,000 Roman soldiers in a tiny country like Judea. What else does it mean? It means, from a Roman perspective, the development of the road system. So the Roman military relied heavily on the very elaborate Roman road system that was built and developed, especially in the 2nd century CE. And that was meant, of course, to facilitate the movement of troops, but its side effects were, of course, also it facilitated travel between the villages, it facilitated trade, it facilitated mobility, and traveling of people, individuals, goods, as well as ideas. So by the mid of the 2nd century CE, we have actually now left the period that we can rightly call the period of revolts. So the Bar Kokhba period, the Bar Kokhba revolt, was the very last provincial uprising in Judea against Roman rule. That doesn't mean, however, that the province was quiet and unruly afterwards. It just became part of the major turmoils that shook the empire from the end of the 2nd century on. And the one that was especially decisive for Judea was the expansion of the Palmyrean Empire, Palmyra over here, which first succeeded from the Roman Empire and then finally spread. You can see actually the territory covered by Palmyra was included Egypt in the 270s, Judea, Palaestina, of course, and Asia Minor up to basically Ankara. You can see up here a coin of the Palmyrean queen Zenobia. Down here you can see a coin of the Roman emperor, the proper Roman emperor, Aurelian, who then, only a year afterwards, managed to push the Pomeranians back, actually to capture Zenobia, to bring her as a captive to Rome. And what is interesting to note in the context of the Lod Mosaic is that we do know from the Historia Augusta, or at least the Historia Augusta claims, that Aurelian, in his triumphal procession, had 200 tame beasts, both from Libya and Palestine, paraded through the streets of Rome. So, if we look at that, the roughly 300 years of Roman rule in Judea actually seem to be a period of turmoil, of first an unruly province, and then a province that is sort of permanently shaken by war, or civil war, or at least uprisings. But we can also retell and narrate the history from another point of view. So what does it really mean to live in a province like that, especially from the second half of the 2nd century on? And what we have seen is that we have now an elaborate road system in Judea, and we also have, from the second half of the 2nd century on, an increasing urbanization in Judea. So we have more and more cities, more and more villages that grow to towns, towns that grow to cities. And one of the cities is Lod, the town we're talking about here. And these cities not only grow, they not only attract a vast population and an increase of population, but they also became cities in terms of administration and in terms of rights. So we have to imagine that all these cities are actually political centers, administrative centers, that rule the territory around them, with civic institutions, with citizens' bodies, with a quasi-autonomous local administration. And most of these cities actually adopt Greco-Roman names. So Lod, for instance, is recalled Diospolis, the city of Zeus. And with the right of a city comes the right to mint bronze coinage, so small currency. And here you can see the actual Empress Julia Domna from the end of the 2nd century, presented here, as well as the goddess Demeter, the portrait of the emperor Elagabalus with actually a pagan temple. So this is clearly now part of the Roman Empire. We have a fully integrated Judea in the Roman Empire. This is something nobody had expected in the 1st century CE. So a vast cultural and political change. It doesn't mean, however, that cities like Lod, cities like Sepphoris, now named Caesarea, and all that, are not Jewish or are not Christian. But we have actually a lot of evidence that Jews participated in the civic institution, that Jews participated in the public life in these cities. So what we now have is Judea as a kind of normal Roman province that is more or less integrated into the Roman Empire with some special features, but in fact and in general, a pretty normal Roman province. And about all these things that aren't normal, Annette will talk.